So I'll start. John Burdick in Anthropology. I'm going to read, and I'm going to read as expeditiously as I can. So in my contribution to this splendid volume, I argued against the view that collaboration means setting aside coercion, that in situations of structural, social, and political inequality, less socially and politically powerful actors actually improve collaborative processes overall for everyone involved by retaining the capacity, threat, and cautious exercise of well-disciplined, nonviolent, coercive inducements. My argument, therefore, was that coercion or coercion and collaboration should not be conceptualized as opposite or as alternatives to each other, nor as sequential stages, but rather as simultaneous parts of a single political ecosystem. By collaboration, I mean any process in which two or more parties articulate a common goal and seek to reach it through shared labor, dialogue, and problem solving. By nonviolent coercion, I mean any action or threat of action, overt or implied, intended to influence the views and or behavior of other parties to the collaboration via the imposition of political, economic, or reputational cost, discomfort, or embarrassment. The types of coercive inducement I have in mind include such things as public criticism and confrontation, going to the media, electoral consequences, and the full range of disruptive, transgressive, and or otherwise contentious actions. That is, actions that derive their primary energy from conflict rather than conciliation. Let me underline the idea of overt or implied threat here. I argue in the chapter that, again, in situations of structural, social, and political inequality between parties to the collaboration, not giving up your powder, letting the other parties to the collaboration know, subtly or not so subtly, that you have powder at the ready, but that you prefer, if possible, to keep it dry, improves the collaboration for everyone. Put differently, in collaborations involving representatives of groups that dispose of significantly different degrees of social and political power, the ongoing threat and cautious occasional exercise of coercive inducements on the part of the less socially and politically powerful participant to the collaboration, far from being a corroder or solvent that makes collaboration deteriorate, makes for better, more productive collaborative processes and outcomes. It does this, I suggest, in several ways, of which I will highlight three rapidly here. First, by retaining and using the thread of coercive inducements during the whole collaborative process, not just at the beginning, all the way through. Representatives of less socially and politically powerful groups get the representatives of socially and politically more powerful groups to pay the kind of serious, engaged, and respectful attention required to make collaboration successful. Without the ongoing threat, subtle or not so subtle, of imposed cost, the representatives of socially and politically more powerful groups are at risk of losing focus, becoming disengaged, and not listening with the kind of serious attentiveness required for productive, successful collaboration. Less socially and politically powerful parties to a collaborative process thus improve collaborative processes by helping the more socially powerful players at the table stay engaged and attentive by communicating the ongoing threat of cost for being inattentive. In the chapter, I provided several cases of semi-public collaborations involving multi-stakeholder advisory councils charged with collaborating in the production of reports to state governments, seeking civil society input to develop better policies of environmental protection and efficient energy consumption. In these cases, representatives of industry enjoying extraordinary influence and access in the state houses of New Mexico and Massachusetts were present at the civil society table but paid demonstrably little attention to the views of politically weak environmental groups, neighborhood associations, and Native American tribes, until these organized a large number of witnesses to testify before the council and made sure media was there for the show. This demonstrated the capacity to impose delays, embarrassment, and potential long-term political costs. If you want to know what happens, read the chapter. Second, I argued that participants in collaborations who represent socially and politically less powerful populations need to send a message to their own constituents that they have not been co-opted. I suggested that the value and sustainability of any collaboratively produced agreement depends in part on the ability of representatives to persuade their constituencies to consent to that agreement. Better collaborations thus depend in part on representatives of socially less powerful populations using the threat and cautious exercise of coercion to maintain base legitimacy. In the chapter, I discussed several illustrations of this process, such as representatives of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference engaging as credible partners with the U.S. Justice Department about how to desegregate public accommodations precisely because they would not back down in their support for direct action and therefore were able to retain credibility as authentic representatives of the mass base to which the policies would need, in effect, to be sold and who would need to be relied upon as the government struggled to implement them in practice. Finally, I argued that the ongoing participation in coercion by the less socially and politically powerful cultivates key habits of mind critical to successful collaboration. The heart of the matter, I suggested, is that for people with less social and political power, the experience of acting or threatening to act coercively has deep, very deep, sociological and psychological effects that are directly valuable to successful collaboration. When the less socially and politically powerful seek to influence the socially and politically more powerful, primarily through offering benefits, their role as subordinates gets reinforced psychologically, and their ability to be fully energetic, creative, and innovative partners at the collaborative table is compromised. In contrast, the experience of and continued threat of influencing more powerful actors via coercion entails the experience of courage, overcoming fear, and liberation from a subordinate role. This experience, I suggested, has enduring effects on effectiveness of participating in the public sphere, of speaking one's mind in public fully and articulately. Crucially, one cannot assume that this process is a kind of one-and-done affair. In situations of power inequality, the feeling of empowerment that derives from the threat of coercion needs to be kept refreshed and vital and at the ready. This does not mean, obviously, that the less socially powerful give up offering carrots and positive inducements. It means simply that without corresponding sticks, carrots can be mistaken on all sides, subjectively as well as objectively, for endless subordination. I offered a variety of examples in the chapter throughout the world of people with experience confronting power head-on, becoming key, highly valuable participants in a variety of collaborative forums, from health councils in Brazil and public service forums in the UK, to participatory budgeting committees in Argentina and rural health councils in Bangladesh. In all these contexts, socially and politically less powerful people who cut their eye teeth in confrontational politics and who continue to keep their organizational powder at the ready are, again and again, among those within such forums who are the most incisive, articulate, and pragmatic in the ideas they propose to help realize the hopes, needs, and dreams of the people they represent. What are some of the practical implications of these points? For government, my chapter suggests the value of being slow to break off dialogue with organized non-state actors who turn to disruptive, transgressive, or contentious action. Elected and appointed officials frequently feel hostile to such action and grow impatient quickly with the non-state actors who use them. My analysis suggests that the state-based actors who remain engaged with organized non-state actors, even when the latter turn to contentious action, are likely to make progress toward finding and generating more broadly legitimate solutions to social problems. Equally important are the practical implications of my argument for social movement actors. In the everyday whirlwind of organizing, social activists frequently shortchange the hard work of internal capacity building. An important implication of my chapter is that developing expertise in both dialogical and confrontational tactics, or collaborative tactics, is important for organizational effectiveness. Activist organizations need to set aside time and resources for discussion of how both collaborative and confrontational tactics fit into their long-term strategy, as well as for training in both confrontation and collaboration, without fearing that the latter will lead to the suspension of the former.
I'm up? Okay. It seems like there needs to be some discussion after that. But I guess we'll get to that. We're going to go to Belize. Yay.
That'd be nice.
So to do Belize in this case study, I had to provide the act. I'm gonna move over. Oh, you wanna?
We'll do it this way.
We just look
Whichever you want.
Yeah.
We'll look at the screen.
I'm gonna. I cannot sit down and talk at the same time. It's one of those weird things. So you can hear me here, right? So this is really a case of civil society, democracy, and shared governance with NGO sector and government in Belize, to really do sort of what we call shared governance, in ecological shared governance. In the environmental world, there's a lot of this that takes place. There's a lot of collaboration, even though Lou doesn't believe it exists or whatever that was to talk about. There is a lot of different agencies and folks across sectors coming together to do wicked problems, because the environment is a multidimensional thing. So this is what this case is here in Belize, is about that. The punchline, the title of the chapter was Civil Society / Government Collaboration in Belize, Central America, from Better to Worse in Shared Ecological Governance. Before I get any farther, I need to recognize my co-author, Osmani Salas, who's Belizean, a former student, and who's been my longtime collaborator in Belize. The punchline, of course, in all of this is from better to worse. As a sociologist, it is, for whom is this better or worse? So there's a lot of discussion about what that means for particular groups, and groups are very important to sort of unit of analysis, if you will, of sociologists. But there's more. Coming out of Lou's sort of conceptual chapter, there's a number of concepts. One was the issue of time. Collaborations can go over a long period of time, be short or they can be long. This is the long-term collaboration. The other, of course, is the power relationship, and sort of getting to what John was talking about a second ago. So here we have, over time, right, decades, you have events that take place. And in these events, there are something that happens that's going to affect that relationship, that collaboration. Right? So that then becomes, it can turn to, it doesn't have to be, but it can turn into conflict. And what we see in this particular case is a larger conflict that boils over and affects this collaboration. And so when you have that moment, that conflict, it does animate, if you will, power relationships. So the powers start coming out to resolve the conflict, and that's what I really want to talk about, is that we'll get to at the end about the power relationships. Okay, so talking about, and how that changes over time. And so there is, this is always a sort of another wave effect after a wave effect of consequences from that conflict, as well as collaboration. So to begin, let me talk a little bit about Belize in 30 seconds. Think of a tropical paradise. Think of jaguars. Think of these strange animals called taiparas. Anybody know a taipara? Yeah, you've been there, yeah. So it's a weird cross between a hippopotamus and an elephant, but miniature. That just roams the forests of Belize and other places. I mentioned jaguars, the best birding in North America, if you will, the sort of the northern hemisphere. And so you have jungles, you have Mayan ruins throughout this region. And then it's this little country situated between Mexico to the north, and Guatemala to the west and south, and then you turn east and you have the Caribbean Sea and the Mesoamerican reef. It's the largest, the longest reef system in the northern hemisphere. It is magical. Turquoise water, unbelievable coral, great, so it's world-class scuba diving and snorkeling and so on. So you have this sort of really ecological paradise of a country the size of New Jersey, with maybe this week, about 400,000 people. So it's a country with nobody there. And it has 70 different ecological zones. So it's a really vibrant sort of ecological paradise that the world international community has been focused on for some time to sort of preserve as a place of great biological stability. It is a democratic country. There are free elections. There's a free press. But it's also a country of 400,000 people, I mentioned, and therefore everybody knows everybody, so the press can be muted when it comes to individuals. Already 5 minutes? Oh, God. All right, so the economy is tiny at 1.7 billion, and mostly from tourism and some agriculture. Okay. So to talk about this conflict, the idea here is that government is incredibly weak, right? You have a nation that's being run by sort of a low-level, county-level administration. I mean, there's just the resources are not there. So in comes civil society to help preserve this ecological wonder. So the government of Belize, that's GOB, turns to during its nationhood in 1981, turns to the Belize Audubon Society, BAS there, to help it manage its new protected areas they have just established. So they do that, and then about 12 years later, they actually establish a formal agreement between the government and the Belize Audubon Society to manage its national parks. This agreement thing between the civil society organization and government sort of seems like a great model. And so in about 10 years, you have now not just one, but 21 NGOs that are involved in shared governance of Belize's national parks and protected areas and all sorts of wonderful ecological resources. So these 21 organizations are having issues. They have common problems. So they form an association called APAMO, Association of Protected Area Management Organization. So it's a great example of civil society coming together to resolve their issues. And they have issues with government. So they approach government to help them issues with their common problems. But government is really largely unresponsive. All this is, fine. But what happens in 2005 is oil is discovered in Belize. So here you have a country that's really based on tourism. Now oil has been discovered in the far western side. And there is now interest in new monetary resource, financial resources. So the government invites in oil companies to go explore for oil in Belize. Since oil was discovered, oil companies come and they start scouring all over Belize for oil. In fact, the protected areas themselves were not spared. So even these protected areas that are being managed by these civil society organizations had to allow these oil companies to come in and do transect lines to explore for oil. So some of these parks were pristine, like nobody's there. They had to build in transect line, opening it up for people for hunting and all sorts of things, and really disrupted a lot of the ecological wonderfulness of that area. So TIM, which is an NGO, sues the government because of its national park that it's particularly interested in and co-manages, says you can't do this, and takes the government to court to sue them from exploring on the land. Well, this starts a whole legal process. The Supreme Court of Belize, a year or so later, says these management agreements have no basis of law, therefore SATIM has no standing, and therefore you have no claim over this land, and therefore you cannot, the lawsuit, the government can do what it's doing. All right, so this sets up a whole series of things. These management agreements are no longer valid. So there's new efforts to establish new. PAMO submits a new contract that would then be more based on law. Nothing happens for 4 years. Then the government of Belize has a new management contract and requires everyone all the coal managers to sign it immediately. Within a year, all of them have, except one. So Tim refused to do so and was thrown out of this shared governance. There's another story to that as well. So there you have a situation where this event took place where you had conflict over the oil exploration, but then was used to sort of adjust the issues of this co-management agreement itself. And the co-management agreement was changed so that two things would happen. One, that the collaborator, the NGO, could not stop any sort of other third-party activities in their protected areas. I mean, if the government wanted to have a logger come in, or a tourist operator, or an oil company, it's fine for them to do so. They can't reject to that. And two, if the NGO should be politically active, essentially, they would lose their co-management agreement. They'd be kicked out of the relationship. So that would be exceeding the scope of the contract. So these NGOs, which were the backbone, the political resistance to this, through APAMO, were silenced by government as a result of this. So that's where it sort of ended, except that, so in no time at all, you have a new relationship, a new agreement signed, okay? So that's sort of the consequences of this. So what happens? Well, you had this conflict, and in this power relationship, there was greater dependency on the NGOs than government, and so most of the NGOs sort of signed the new agreement and gave up their sort of rights to political voice, and so there's a new normal on that. All organizations except for one have signed, but you also had a situation then where this then spilled over into another area, where BTIA, another association of the Business Tourism Industry Association, Belize Business and Tourism Association, was really excited, agitated by this whole exploration, really affecting their livelihoods, and they became much more politically active as a result of this whole event. They formed, with the teachers' union, the BNN, Belize Non-Government Organization Network, and have been very active. This is a much more umbrella organization as a result of this event. So from this came, if you will, so democracy was hurt by reducing the voice of these very powerful actors. These are the most professional organizations in Belize, these conservation organizations, but now has been replaced by actually a better organization that has more encompassing and broader reach across all of Belize. So that's sort of where things stand. There's a couple of sort of results I want to mention. So conceptually, you had a situation where you have I used sort of agency theory. We used issues of stakeholder theory, and really had a situation where the relationship changed from really one of stewardship situation to an agency theory, where it came from a more positive to a real negative, and where the Belizean government really thought of the NGOs as sort of special interests, not in the issues of government well-being or interests. There is a sort of norm there in Belize that democracy ends with voting. Once you vote in your political party, that's it. The people and its organizations have no say in what the government does. And so this was an effort by Belizean organizations to really come back and sort of have a greater voice in what happens in their country. So we have this new set of relationships, but what has happened is that now the oil companies have left. So we have, we don't know, no one knows what they know, but somebody knows what they know. Is there oil there or not? We don't know. There was transects done outside in the reefs, and that there was a huge uproar over that because that's Belize's livelihood. And the ship was sent away, and so on. But obviously the transects were done. So in ending, So what has happened, and we can talk more about the power dynamics in this and the consequences of this which in discussion if we need to. But what has happened is here you have the Prime Minister, Dean Barrows, who was the one most actively pushing for oil exploration, received a major conservation award in 2017 by Oceana, an international group that's really worried about the oceans because of the Mesoamerican reef they're involved in Belize, gave Dean Barrows, Prime Minister Barrows, a award because he signed a moratorium of no drilling for oil in the Mesoamerican reef. So he created the crisis, and now he gets a reward for ending the crisis, and so a very Trumpian-like sort of move at the end of that. So part of what the BNN did, and I'm really done, is called for a senator from the NGO, for a senator from the NGO committee, an individual be placed in the Belizean Senate by the to represent the NGO community. This was fought for a long time, but the BNN with the Teachers Union made this happen, and they have now a new senator representing the NGO community on the Belizean Senate. The Senate, however, is an honorific kind of thing. And who is this new senator? It's my co-author, Osmani Salas, a former student, great guy, but since then he's been a little bit insufferable. But it's an interesting story how these have these ripple effects where you push at one end power relationships and change some dynamic, but a new dynamic comes out and has a different set of consequences. Thank you. Sorry for going over. Oh, I mean, that's it.
You want to put it all the way down so that we can
Yeah.
see the screen?
Oh, you have it all set up there?
So let me begin by saying apologies to you because I'll be leaving probably in the middle of your talk. I have to go meet a class.
One of those teaching things.
Although I'd rather hear you.
On Friday afternoon?
Not only that, I have to meet them tomorrow 9 to 5 as well, so there you go.
Lord.
So the chapter that I did together with Chandel Sanchez and Sandra Lane is called Coercing Consensus, Notes on Power and Hegemony and Collaboration. One could begin, as we did with the chapter, by saying, gee, we've noticed some changes in the way in which collaboration as a term has been valued, by noting that at one point in time we called it, I have a mic.
It's like,
To be called a collaborator would get you killed or I guess what's worse. But now it is a particularly valued thing. So one can begin that way. But to be most honest, the way we came to this paper, the way I came to this paper, was having experienced at this university a variety of collaborative processes that I thought were particularly bad in the ways in which the analysis outside of the university that we give reflected. So we start with that, and we start also with the understanding that after going and reviewing the literature on collaboration, which begins with a 1989 book by Barbara Gray, that there is no single widespread, well, no single accepted definition of what collaboration is, despite its being acclaimed both in technical and in popular literature. So in our paper, we look at some of the ways in which power dynamics distort collaborative processes, and then we express a concern about the way in which the valorization of collaboration shapes and censors interactions, particularly marking contention and critique, among other things, as sort of out of bounds. So we begin the paper by characterizing collaboration, and we think, of course, that there are collaboration can be a very good thing that, to use Barbara Gray's little statement, collaboration is based on the simple adage that two heads are better than one, and that one by itself is simply not enough, can in some circumstances be very helpful. But we notice in the literature 4 aspects of collaboration that we think that define what we take collaboration to be. Collaboration creates added value, it's more efficient, and it develops through a negotiated order. There's a 4th aspect, which is that the move for collaboration marks joint problem solving as a valorized approach, and it marks off particular ways in which we should carry out our collaborations. Now, I want to say, in the interest of maybe hearing a little bit of what Peggy is going to present, that collaboration in all of these models depends upon consensus. And consensus is a decision procedure that involves going on until no one objects. So it takes a long time. And when collaboration is thought of as an efficiency tool, in the popular literature, it's thought of as a time-saving mechanism, which it's not. Second, we've noticed in the literature some advice that if you're running a collaborative project and some of your collaborators are not behaving well, then it's perfectly okay to cut them out. I've spoken at PARCC about this notion of collaborative thuggery, which strikes me as a particular oxymoron. The prerequisites for collaboration: you do need to have a shared sense of purpose, a common goal, and we think that can be quite good. But the idea that collaboration itself is a virtuous thing, it's a good end in itself, is now a recurring trope in a variety of domains of our social life. And to that end, collaboration can be used to legitimate actions that enforce norms of interaction, that allow more powerful institutions and organizations to arrive at a unilateral solution to problems. And our contention in the paper is that this winds up marking individuals and groups as deeply flawed in a Goffman kind of sense of creating stigma around people. And the second is that the second aspect that we explore is the way in which powerful individuals and organizations can use collaboration cynically to achieve their own ends. We use 2 case studies in the paper, one set in the United Arab Emirates, where an NGO has to deal with the royal family and the power differential affects the nature of the collaboration. The second looking at collaboration among military and civilian actors in humanitarian efforts, in which we report the observation that despite the best intentions of collaboration that we see, that eventually the collaboration gets shifted to power in the military, pushes the NGOs aside, and does things their own way. Now, our contention is not that collaboration is bad. We think, in fact, that collaboration done in the right context with the right set of commitments, with the equalization of power differences, can be quite effective. But we are deeply concerned about the overuse of the term collaboration, because at its worst, collaboration can be used as a cudgel to legitimate the achievement by one party of their own goals. And we think it's time to step back and treat collaboration as a tool that is appropriate in some circumstances and not in others. So I will stop with that, and we can move on. I think I saved 3 minutes for you.
Wow. Okay. I have to wait for my PowerPoint to come up.
Right there.
It's up there.
It's on the side ones.
Okay.
I can try to get that.
Well, I
middle one
just
off.
need to be able to see the PowerPoint, which I can do on that screen. So, my paper is in very good. I'm going to look at it up there. Thank you so much. So my paper is somewhat different in that it is a particular case study of a series of events that involved American Catholic nuns beginning in 2008 when the sisters began to be investigated by the Vatican for activities that were not considered in keeping with Catholic teaching and particularly with Catholic attitudes on gender and power. So what I wanted to do in my contribution to this larger project of the book is to bring in both history and gender, and also to talk about how conflict and collaboration could be analyzed within a context that was totally non-governmental. And so I'm doing mine within the context of the Catholic Church. And the principal actors are the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and two different groups of Catholic sisters. One group is what we might call more mainstream or progressive, constituting about 80% of the sisters in the United States who are not cloistered. So these are the ones that teach, nurse, do social work, and other kinds of active works. And then the 20% that are more traditional and conservative, who, in a very simplistic way, we could suggest the Vatican, at the time this began in 2008, would have liked all sisters to be like. Now, keep in mind that there was a big shift in the middle of this that I may not have time to discuss, which was the election of Pope Francis, who is much more sympathetic to the kind of religious life that these more progressive sisters are all about. But at the time, we're talking about the era of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. So the Vatican decided in 2008 to investigate American sisters, and they call this investigation an apostolic visitation. And the apostolic visitation, in the words of, whoops, how do I get back? What?
I put it back.
Thank you. The apostolic visitation involved three particular aspects: solidarity, integrity, and transformation. Now, you have to understand one thing before I go any further. The sisters I'm talking about have a profoundly spiritual and profoundly pragmatic view of the world. And so for them, talking about the spiritual context in which they consider confrontation and collaboration is absolutely essential. You don't have to buy it, but you have to understand that they do. Okay, so I'm not going to read, I don't believe in reading, now it's not moving at all. Okay, okay. So it's not moving at all.
I think I can be doing on this thing instead.
Okay, that would be
So
better.
sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. You
Don't
just-
take this away from my time.
Just use the that
Yes,
arrow.
I got it.
You
Okay.
got it.
So it involves solidarity, integrity, and transformation. I've got some text in which the sisters themselves are articulating what they mean by these things, which I do not intend to read because I find that incredibly annoying. But the point is that in the process of understanding what for them solidarity and community was all about, they went from seeing solidarity and community as something that involved their particular religious congregations, the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Charity, Franciscan sisters, to a larger concentric circles of sisterhood involving all of these communities, understanding what they had in common and working from that basis rather than emphasizing their individuality. They were also strengthened by solidarity with people outside the Catholic Church, outside of religious life. So lay people, men and women, who supported them and who worked with them in collaboration in responding to, and in some cases, confronting the Vatican and the hierarchy. Their integrity also became a factor because and this is where the historical context comes in. These sisters had been called to live out their spirituality and their particular understandings of what they were all about by the Vatican itself in the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. They saw this as directly challenging the integrity of the response that they had implemented. And so it's now gone back about 50 years. And in the article, I discuss a variety of historical events in which this evolved. So I will read this one passage which says, the apostolic visitation seemed to force these women to come to grips with their situation of subordination, finding voice, claiming and affirming identity, critiquing the situation in light of their vocational call. So, and they didn't do this as individuals, but they did this collectively. And finally, they found the whole experience, rather than being a negative one, they ultimately found it to be a positive and transformative one, because they discovered this kind of collaborative solidarity. And so that was really, I think, a surprising outcome for them, as well as for me when I was investigating this. I didn't think that their overall response would be primarily positive. Theoretically, in this article, I use a concept that was articulated by a feminist theologian named Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, the concept of kyriarchy, and that's a word that's in the title, and it's also discussed in the article itself. Kyriarchy is a term she developed now about 25 years ago, and it's an intersectional concept. It goes beyond patriarchy because it doesn't mean that only men can exercise kyriarchy, but it addresses the intersection of sexism, homophobia, economic injustice, and other forms of dominating hierarchies. And so what these women realized that they were doing was that they were confronting kyriarchy. And in so doing, I think they provide us with a model of how feminist process and also how contemplative discernment, which is a form of prayer in which they engaged, were used to respond to this and respond very effectively. I am not suggesting, by the way, that groups like the University Senate go into contemplative mode, but, you know, some things, it might work better than some things that have been tried. The other thing I think is important is to notice that there are two very different understandings of how people are organized: qualitative versus quantitative, and hierarchical versus this collegial consensual one. So they would be more likely to see themselves as the spiral, as the concentric circles, whereas the Vatican understands the world to be organized in a quantitative and hierarchical, pyramidical form. So I want to just show a couple of pictures that demonstrate that the contrast between the more traditional sisters and these more collaborative and contemporary sisters. So the first picture I want to show you is the Leadership Conference of Women Religious gathering in 2012 at the height of the Apostolic Visitation at their meeting in St. Louis, Missouri. These are all leaders who used to be called Mother Generals or Mother Superiors of religious congregations of nuns marching through the city of St. Louis. And they represent the more progressive sisters. There's also an organization of the more traditional sisters called the Conference of Major Superiors of Women Religious, CMSWR. And they meet annually as well. And here's a picture of their meeting from 2013. And their leaders. They also even organize themselves during their sessions in contrasting ways. Here is a picture of CMSWR in session in 2014. And here's a picture of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in the same year. So I think these contrasting images are really illustrative of this. And yet, when the apostolic visitation ended in 2014, there was even some coming together of these two organizations at the conference organizing this in Rome. I want to conclude by just quoting from one of the sisters who wrote about this in a book called The Power of Sisterhood, which really allows the sisters to describe this experience for themselves. My article was also based on extensive interviews with sisters who were involved in the process, both in terms of being leaders and in terms of leading workshops on contemplative praxis. And Marianne Zollerman said, in an ironic and paradoxical way, the lack of a Vatican evaluation, because the thing just kind of died after Pope Francis came into office, has given us the opportunity to cull out our own meanings and learnings from the event, liberating us to break through and beyond the confines of Rome's assessment of us. So what I wanted to do in this article was not only share some of my own research on nuns, but also to show that both history and feminist theory are useful tools in addressing questions of conflict and collaboration. I'm done. Apparently, we've just answered all possible.
So if you can still think of more questions, but if there are no questions, then we did want to leave a few minutes for people to suggest, out of what they've heard, are there themes, critical research questions that this book becomes the foundation for?
So I come from public administration, and I thought it was really interesting your point on how the collaboration literature in public administration could do better at pulling from other disciplines. And one common word I heard almost all of you say was power, and I would love to get a detailed, like maybe list or detailed chapter on power, or see more research on that, or maybe conduct it myself. I'm a first-year doctoral student, so yeah. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Are you in public administration?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think let me just say one thing, which is that just as the word collaboration has many meanings and is contentious, I think the word power is as well. Power can be a very negative force, and we've heard some examples of that in a number of the talks today. But power can also be empowering and therefore be a positive force. And so I think that in any analysis of power, we need to interrogate its various meanings and not just assume that there's a consensus over that word, just as there isn't about some of these other words.
To piggyback on that, I think it's one of the interesting ideas that I'm feeling is coming out is that to think about not an either or of a term is normative or not normative. I think that's probably a cognitive error. These are continua and hybrids, and at the same time, it's interesting to think about collaboration as a term that makes claims that are analytical, which some of which I think are fair and justified. But it's sort of like, I was making a list of terms that are like collaboration, and I came up with a short list because they each have a pretty heavy normative charge, especially depending on historical conjunctures, like community, which is often used analytically, but also there's a powerful normative charge depending upon context. Words like participation is another one, participatory. I come out of a tradition of participatory action research, which is supposed to be self-evidently good, but when you think about, well, participation there, that's being thrown into the hopper to legitimate it, but when you actually start looking at practices, there's a whole range of what that refers to on the ground, and some are more or less, but they all get, because of a nominalist, commitment to use the term, those get kind of homogenized. Grassroots, I cop to that. I mean, when we legitimate something, I come out of an activist social movement background. Even the phrase social movements is an ideologically and normatively charged term. I think that, or dialogue, I mean, you name it, there are lots of terms. Any term is a hybrid, but I think that a research agenda that would allow sort of decenter collaboration as, or to raise the question analytically, empirically, how is it used? What are the various uses of collaboration would be an interesting ongoing research agenda, I think.
I'm sorry, I'm moving because those spotlights are really.
So I'm sort of trying to
giving
build
me a
on that. I think that's
headache. I'm not like rejecting the conversation. Just the spotlights.
One of the things that struck me in my case was this idea of sort of unexpected events. You have this collaboration going, something out of left field comes in, creates a conflict, unexpected conflict, that then has all sorts of spillover effects. Then it, so you have a moment in time where then this conflict, as I said early on, sort of animates the power dynamics, because there is going to be winners and losers in this new event that has shown up. In this case, oil showed up in Belize, which was this ecological paradise. No one expected this. And for 10 years is this whole contention, and then the oil companies leave. And now we're left with a situation in Belize where now, and they could come back, but there's some changes that were made in Belize as a result that at one level hurt democracy, but in another level, in civil society in particular, in its ability to participate in sort of engaging democracy and oversight of government. That sort of harmed this event, ended up harming a set of actors, but then encouraged a set of others to take up that space. So you have a sort of a rolling effect of you push somewhere and something else comes out somewhere else to counteract that. And in the end, I think what has happened is after this event, Belizean civil society has actually gotten stronger, even though a set of actors have gotten weaker. So it's all of this because of this one event. It has redefined the set of relationships, but a new set of relationships has emerged. It's a counteractive to that. And all this was, clearly government in this case saw dollar signs. The Belizean government is hugely in debt, and spending on tourism dollars is not going to make the elite very wealthy, but they're working on that. But anyhow, but this idea of sort of an external event coming out of changing power, not changing the dynamics, but animating those dynamics and changing the status quo, establishing a new pattern after that, I think is really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think that was the interesting thing about both of your cases, was the fact that it disempowered but empowered, right?
Yeah.
And I think as I look at different collaboration studies, what they don't do, which the conflict studies do. So, conflict always says, there's going to be a chain, right? So it's not the end of the conflict. There'll be a new one. It's transformed. But I don't think collaboration studies do that. They don't say, okay, well, what happened then?
Yeah.
They came to some conclusion, resolution, but did it really end? So it's interesting when I think about it. I think that's a whole interesting area that one could look at that's not been looked at.
Well,
I think
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, that's I wish it were true what you said about conflict studies, because I think we tend too much to focus on there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, when it doesn't end.
Right.
And there's a reaction. I mean, we studied the civil rights struggle, and it ends with success, but there was a reaction, and it's a chain, and it goes on and on.
It's a dialectic.
And it doesn't even need external. The external is always lurking, but internally even there's a shifting of alliances and backlashes, and that's built in, I guess, to the overreaching that goes on in conflicts. Nearly always there's people who are winning overreach, and there's a fallback. And we don't kind of study it a little bit too narrowly and not look at the chains.
And one of the things that, I think one of the misunderstandings about history is that it's primarily narrative. And I think some history is primarily narrative. But there's also a sense in which history is understood in more process-related terms that can be helpful here. So, for example, in my case, in an aspect of it that I really couldn't discuss in the 10 minutes, but that I do try to discuss a little bit in the article, is that these were sisters who had had quite a series of conflicts with the Vatican, from which they learned and from which they changed. And so if you compare the response of these sisters during the apostolic visitation to earlier confrontations with the Vatican in which they hadn't learned to act, and I will use this word deliberately, collaboratively, in which they had, in which they acted rather hierarchically, and so forth, and they hadn't changed their process and their praxis of how to respond, and they were much less successful. And by successful, what I mean is in maintaining their own integrity and in enabling their voices to be heard in a situation in which technically they had much less power, but practically they actually had quite a bit of power. And so I think looking at this historically is one way of responding, in whether you're talking about conflict or collaboration, to see how these situations change and how the dynamics change.
Miriam, I'm wondering what you're thinking about in reference.
Yeah, I'm thinking that one of the great aspects of this book is the difference in scale and scope, so that we move from conflict and potential cooperation and collaboration in the boardroom to international conflicts that could involve war and the loss of sovereignty, and death and killing and violence and street violence and the state being repressive and oppressive. And yet, usually you'd only find a book on one of those. They would be compartmentalized, right? But we've created a book where we go across all these different types of conflicts with different kinds of dimensions of cost, but no less, in the boardroom, you may not have a policy for the state, right? Which can create a lot of damage for society. So I don't think there's no dead bodies, right? In the boardroom, they're not bringing in their militaries, usually, right? In PA, right? You talk about power, it was a great point and comment. So in IR, the power is invasion, right? And sort of the large scale World War I, World War II, right? We think of, so collaboration becomes costly because of the the lack of trust, warfighting capabilities that could be augmented if you make a mistake. So I think, what are the risks of failure to collaborate? We haven't talked about that, right? So those kinds of differences in scale, and I think, in some of these cases, failure isn't an option, But in other cases, failure might be okay. But, you know, the next day we'll try again, or we'll try. And so that might, I mean, I think we may want to see, like, what we can do in PARCC to be that intellectual center that grapples with those kinds of issues in an interdisciplinary way. So I don't think anybody else does this kind of thing. You know, we're all siloed off in our disciplines and other places, and here we're coming together and looking at these, and yet we're able to find so much commonality in terms of collaboration not necessarily being terrific, right? Power relationships. I love the term collaborative thuggery, so that people engage in, Robert's not here, but people who engage in collaboration might have ulterior motives to keep power, you know, and so, so maybe volume 2 or an article, a journal article for a major journal.
Or even a conference. I mean,
you know,
a conference to address some of these things.
because I think we're
To
bringing,
carry on the
we're
discussion
bringing so
we're
many
having today.
counterintuitive findings
Yeah.
for PA, and particularly for PA, I think. And then, you know, but for all the, I mean, this notion that cooperation and collaboration is normatively good, and yet we're really pushing the envelope on that, I think that needs to be in article form.
I think so too.
I love that point where you said, because it is true, everything is based on this idea that collaboration is positive automatically, and then you guys took a step back and you're like, wait a second.
Not
like,
always.
Maybe we should look at this a little closer. I thought that was really innovative.
But even when you talked about the price of failure just now,
right.
which I think is interesting, because how do different actors assess the cost of failure? Because, I mean, obviously there's the big one of war and peace, life and death.
Right.
But there are other costs of failure that different actors and different segments of society might assess very differently, right? So what's important to you may not be important to me, but if you find it important, then you're going to respond accordingly, and I need to understand that if I'm going to interact with you in any way, collaboratively, conflictually, or whatever, right? I need to understand what's motivating you and what's grounding your actions.
Well, and people may react differently, so if the risk of
Exactly.
failure is high,
Right.
and I feel the collaboration is not moving where I need it to move, I can certainly do many things, but two things I can do is, one, I can exert my power, but the other would be that I could invest more in the collaboration to make it work more effectively for what I need. So it'd kind of be interesting to see if there were a way of studying how people react to that risk of failure. I don't know how.
Or they could leave.
Or they could leave. I mean,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
Right?
That's true.
Yeah, they could certainly walk away. And the beauty of some of the people in this group is they do, I mean, I think of Belize and, you know, the nuns and maybe others. We do have some overtime cases,
Yeah.
you know, where one could look at these collaborations over time through some of these lenses.
But I like the idea of, I mean, one of the things I haven't completely read all the articles, but I've been reading a number of the articles that I hadn't read before. And one of the things that I really appreciate is both how different the different disciplinary perspectives are, but how beneficial it is to expose ourselves to these different approaches. Because, I mean, I'm thinking about things in ways I hadn't considered before as a result of reading this work, and also finding some of the resources that are cited in some of the work that I'm finding really useful. And one of the things I've appreciated in this project is that opportunity to educate myself. So it's not just an anthology where I am speaking as expert and that's my role, but I'm also learning in ways that I think are really constructive. And some of the ideas, you know, I don't ultimately buy, but at least they got me thinking in new ways about issues. So that's good. So I don't want it to end, is what I'm saying. I don't know if we need another book, because some of us may not live long enough if it takes as long as this one. But I think there needs to be an ongoing. I don't think this should be the end.
Yeah. I don't know. Anybody else? Anyone from the crowd? That's my husband, by the way. I should.
Hello, husband. Does he have a name?
Joe.
Joe. Hi, Joe.
And Robert, you've been quiet here. You want to chime in?
Actually,
Well, then let me thank everybody, our authors, our supporters, our audience, and again, I think from Lou and my perspective, I'll speak for Lou. This has probably accomplished what we hoped it would accomplish, which is getting us all together and reminding ourselves of what we did. And you hear different things when you hear people talk. So it's been very useful, I think, for us to hear people talk about their work.
And let me thank the two of you for doing this. So not only this, but the book itself. It was one of those events where it just sort of unfolded, and it just got better and better and better and better. And it goes down, at least for me, one of those rare events in one's academic life where this was a lot of fun. This was really interesting. Mm-hmm. And there's, most of the things that we end up doing, it's not quite as fun as we thought they were going to be. But this was one of those occasions where it really was, and that goes back to the two.
Yeah, I think it's amazing for academics how rare it is.
Yeah. Exactly.
Graduate students in here, don't say that.
Doctoral defenses, the faculty enjoy them so much because they can talk to each other about some issues instead of talking about the exam that has to be made up which
the
who's
papers
gonna
we've
teach
been
what.
grading, right?
So much. So it was. I think was really fun. And
No, that's true.
Clearly, we
Of course.
don't do it very well, and very much anyway. So we thank everybody for it, and I agree. We ought to keep doing some things like that, even if not a book, at least an article, or maybe. Of course, I'm consumed with what's going on in this country at the moment, and I still think that we ought to pay attention to how our work is relevant to saving our democracy. So,
Yes,
that's just my concern. I don't think alone.
We all need to vote on November 6th.
Absolutely. All right. So on that note, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.